When the border between Maine and New Brunswick was agreed on in 1842, overnight French-Acadian families along the St. John River were divided. On the New Brunswick side, the French language flourished, but that could not be said for many Franco families on the Maine side. Thanks for joining me on News Center Maine Plus. I'm Sharon Rose. The French language in Maine has a deep history, and part of it includes suppression. Despite making up nearly a quarter of Maine's population today, most Franco-Americans know little of their culture, much less the language. In June of 2021, former News Center Maine reporter Hannah Yashivi brought us a detailed look at the French Disconnection.
We never really had any ability to understand the French language or even have it spoke to us because our parents were told by their parents that they shouldn't speak French because they get in trouble.
My generation, we lived through a very oppressive time where we were not allowed to speak French. So in terms of your own id, your own ego, you know, you're seen as an inferior individual.
It all boils down to what does a language represent?
A common ache among French-American voices. They were less than. In 1785, French-Acadians first arrived in what eventually would become Maine after being pushed out of southern New Brunswick by British soldiers. In 1820, Maine became a state, but defining the border between northern Maine and southern Canada took more than 20 years after that.
Le gouvernement des deux pays ont convenu de diviser les États-Unis et le Canada le long du fleuve Saint-Jean.
And so this people was divided in two different countries, two different languages.
One people suddenly stuck on opposing sides of an international boundary, forced to evolve differently.
Eventually, those ties become eroded.
In Canada, French remained the primary language, but on the American side, things took a quick turn.
There was a strong push to Americanize the population.
French is a vital part of the Franco-Acadian culture. It was fully used in schools, at church, in houses, everywhere, until a Maine law in 1919 tried to change that.
It's not just a figment of people's imagination. I mean, it's a law that was passed here at this building that people couldn't speak French because of racism. And that's never going to be right.
That law required schools to teach children only in English. Lines in the teacher's handbook for many decades read, "Each teacher has an added responsibility in making sure that English is used at all times at school. Let no child approach you in French."
If the children were caught speaking French other than in French class, it was possible that the school would lose their funding.
So for many, many years, teachers punished children simply for speaking French.
I think one of the most striking things that I've seen about this to really galvanize what it meant at that time for people in my mind
was this painting of a girl writing lines over and over again as punishment. She writes, "I will not speak French in school."
We were seen as second-rate citizens, and when we came here in Maine, we were treated as such.
To embrace your own people, heritage, and language was unacceptable, and for the record, it wasn't subtle. Along with the no French law, there was also the arrival of the Ku Klux Klan in Maine.
They were here not to fight the blacks in Maine, but the French Canadians.
The ugly truth, according to a document written by Maine historian Rainey Bench, at its peak in 1920, the members of the KKK in Maine represented 23% of the state's population.
There were more members in the KKK in New England than there were in the South.
New laws and the brute force of the KKK were enough for parents to stop passing down to their children an important part of their culture, their French language.
They did not want their children to go through the prejudices and the punishments that were inflicted upon them.
What it did was it unfortunately took people's heritage away from them.
The No French law was finally repealed in 1960, but according to retired Frenchville Superintendent Lisa Bernier, it was too late.
Which is sad because who's going to carry it forward?
The French classes now taught in the St. John Valley public schools is at a low level. The number of French teachers is also low, and structured French programs don't start until middle school.
We're not teaching math in French or science in French, or we used to. We had in the mid to late 90s, we had an immersion program at the elementary level, and that was quite successful. However, it disappeared with lack of funding.
Fewer high school students are picking up French courses, making the only language their grandparents ever spoke foreign.
Ça fait mal au cœur voir que la langue de mes parents et grands-parents disparaît.
The French language carries traditions, it carries culture.
Traditions and culture, and a language that once thrived in Maine, now mostly a memory. Hannah Yeshivi, New Centre, Maine.
Even though there was a huge effort to disregard French history in Maine decades ago, there's now an effort to keep the language and culture alive. According to the latest census numbers, nearly 1 in 4 people in Maine identify themselves as Franco-American or French-Canadian, making them the largest ethnic group in the state. But because of the French disconnection, being French and speaking the language are two different things. According to the census, about 50 years ago, 14% of Mainers said they spoke French at home. But by 2019, that number was down to just 3%. In part 2 of Hannah Yeshivi's project back from 2021, she shows us how some people in northern Maine are working on the French reconnection.
The lost generation is people like myself that never had French spoke to them because it was frowned on, and so therefore I don't speak French, and my parents don't either.
And when I started kindergarten, we were punished. And to me, I didn't speak French to my children because I did not want them to go through what I went through.
Here you have children playing outside all together. Their mother tongue is French, and they can't speak French.
French-Acadians had to hide their culture and native language at school, the one safe place they had left to share and celebrate their culture was on Sundays, in church.
The church became a bastion for the French culture because that was one place where you could basically express yourself as a Franco-Acadian.
But the net result of the No French law passed in 1919, which was enforced for 41 years until 1960, was that French culture and language were decimated.
De quoi êtes-vous le plus inquiète?
Ce qui m'inquiète le plus est la perte de la langue française parce qu'elle a survécu tant de centenaires et tant de tragédies et tant d'histoires de famille.
C'est bonjour!
Today, there is not one full-time French program at any elementary school in the St. John Valley. Instead, one French teacher rotates among the 3 elementary schools. She moves from Fort Kent to Madawaska to Frenchville, and she's not even full-time.
It is successful, but the one person we have is half-time, and she'll spend part of her year in one elementary school, another third of her year in another, and then another third of her year. As school enrollments go down, budgets get trimmed, and programs are weighed for their necessity. Numbers of classes, numbers of sections for classes, all of that decreases.
Currently, 2 French teachers cross the border every day from Edmonton, Canada.
Moi, je porte des culottes bleues. Toi, tu portes des quelle couleur?
I teach grades 5 to grade 9.
Commencez avec le numéro 1. If you begin with number 1.
Qu'avez-vous appris aujourd'hui dans la classe?
When the bell rings and students head home, Madame Nadeau gets ready to cross the border back to Canada.
We have an app that's Arrive Can. In that code, the custom officers need to see it. C'est ça mon but, c'est d'apprendre à parler français ou à faire une communication avec les autres.
The St. John Valley still contains the highest percentage of French speakers in Maine, but the language continues losing ground and the lack of certified teachers is evident. L'Association Française has taken matters into its own hands. It is offering after-school French classes for preschoolers in the valley. So far, 25 students are enrolled.
We see our French dying, and we know that children learn languages very quickly. And so we felt it was important to work with young kids and their families and hopefully do something to preserve the language and the culture of our community.
Nancy Dion says if they can get to preteen children, they have a shot at growing the language.
Here
at Madawaska High School, something unthinkable when the no French law was being enforced is now happening. Professor Kurt Susi is encouraging his students to speak French as much as possible.
I'm 68 years old. I'm not going to be here forever. And right now, I think that there's a major concern that the pot is empty.
Je pense que c'est plus les parents qui parlent pas français à leurs enfants. C'est pas important à la maison, so pourquoi ce serait important à l'école?
And I don't know what the answers are, other than hopefully, as a dad and my wife as a mom, that we have entrenched in our own kids those core values.
It should be taught in the elementary schools. That's what I would love to see.
But that requires a huge and expensive effort. For the newer generations to learn it and live it, the French Embassy in Washington, D.C. is willing to help fund a French immersion school in northern Maine.
Le Maine, c'est l'une des États les plus francophones aux États-Unis.
The only requirement.
The key criteria is that 30% of the non-linguistic content has to be in French.
But it must go beyond the French language. Priest and historian Jacques Lapuente says there's much more to preserving a person's cultural identity.
We need to know who we are and where we come from. And it is not a negative. We are not less American because we recognize that we have roots that come from elsewhere.
They're Mainers, and they mean something. They have value just like all of us.
French Americans, an intrinsic part of Maine.
Left everything that they owned to be able to come and be living in freedom and democracy.
Only to have the freedom to keep their culture alive outlawed, and bringing their Franco-Acadian culture back will be just as hard. Hannah Yashivi, News Center, Maine.
Franco-Americans in Maine tell us the best way to support their culture and language is to embrace efforts being made today. So here are some ways you could do that. The University of Maine in Orono offers minors in Franco-American Studies, Canadian Studies, and French. UMaine's Franco-American Center also periodically publishes a French and English magazine called Le Forum. It features events, articles, and initiatives from Franco-Americans in Maine for everyone to take part in. And the Acadian Archives at UMaine Fort Kent hosts classes, programs, and activities year-round as a way to celebrate and enrich the culture in the area. Thanks for watching on News Center Maine Plus, and be sure to come back for more stories from our archives as well as new exclusive content you won't see on our broadcast channel.